when a gunner fought through hell to save a friend. In the thick jungles of Vietnam, under a monsoon sky, a lone gunner prepared to face the unimaginable. It was 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War, and two German soldiers found themselves far from home, fighting alongside American troops. They were volunteers, brothers not by blood but by bond, united by a common cause and a friendship forged in the fires of battle. Our story follows one of them, a machine gunner named Carl, who would risk everything to save his closest friend, Franz. This is a tale of loyalty and courage, where one man fights through hell to bring his brother-in-arms home. The ambush in the jungle. Carl and Franz moved warily with their patrol through the humid jungle. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth, and every rustle of leaves set nerves on edge. They were deep in enemy territory on a routine sweep, hearts pounding behind cautious breaths. Suddenly the silence shattered. A crack of gunfire, then a barrage, an ambush. Gunfire erupted from the dense foliage on all sides. Muzzle flashes flickered like fireflies in the gloom as Viet Cong guerrillas sprung their trap. Carl instinctively dropped to the ground behind a fallen log, his fingers clenching around the heavy M60 machine gun he carried. He swiftly returned fire, the M60's barrel spitting out a furious hail of bullets. Empty casings jingled onto the damp earth. Beside him, Franz fired his rifle into the green abyss, shouting a warning in German-accented English to their squad mates. Explosions rang out as enemy grenades and RPGs struck. Shrapnel whizzed through the air. Chaos reigned. Carl's heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to focus, fear and adrenaline mixing in his veins. He saw movement to his right, an enemy flanking. Before Carl could pivot, Franz rose to stop the threat. Franz's brave burst of gunfire took down the flank, but in that split second, an RPG rocket exploded behind them. The blast threw Carl forward, ears ringing and vision blurred. When Carl staggered up, dazed, the ambush had been repelled by their squad, but Franz was nowhere to be seen. Carl's eyes frantically scanned for his friend amid the smoke and dripping foliage. He spotted Franz's helmet lying near a splintered tree trunk, but no sign of Franz himself. The realization hit Carl like a punch. Franz had been separated, possibly wounded or captured in the chaos. "Franz! Franz!" Carl shouted hoarsely, his voice raw with panic. No answer, only the distant thunder of retreating enemy footsteps in the bush. Carl's squad leader grabbed his arm, urging, "We have to move now!" Reinforcements for the enemy could be closing in. Carl resisted, desperation flooding him. He couldn't leave his friend behind. But amid the confusion, the surviving soldiers were already falling back to safer ground, dragging their own wounded along. Carl was yanked away with them as heavy monsoon raindrops began to patter through the canopy, a brother left behind. Under the cover of thick foliage a few hundred yards from the ambush site, the battered unit regrouped. Night was falling, and the jungle grew eerily quiet except for the soft rain and the groans of the wounded. Carl sat on the muddy ground, rainwater and sweat mingling on his face, staring blankly at the dark tree line they had retreated from. Franz was out there somewhere in that darkness, behind enemy lines. Every flash of lightning stirred Carl's hope that he'd glimpse Franz stumbling out of the jungle. But with each passing minute, hope dimmed. A medic attended to a cut on Carl's arm, but the gunner felt nothing except the ache in his chest. He remembered seeing Franz at the moment of the explosion, how Franz had pushed forward fearlessly to cover him. Franz had saved Carl's life, likely at the cost of being left behind. Carl's commanding officer grimly approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, I'm sorry. We can't go back out there tonight. It's too risky. We'll radio for a search at first light." The words were meant to comfort, but they only fueled Carl's guilt. What if Franz didn't have until first light? What if he was bleeding out or taken captive right now? The thought of his best friend alone in enemy hands was unbearable. As the others hunkered down for the rainy night, Carl's mind churned through fragments of memory. Flashback. Bonds forged in battle. Carl recalled a quieter night a few months before when he and Franz shared a rare moment of peace under the stars. They were new in Vietnam then, two young Germans far from home, weary after a long patrol. Franz had shown Carl a creased photograph of himself with his little brother back in Germany, and with determined eyes whispered, "I fight, so my brother will never have to see war." In that moment, Carl and Franz made a pact to always watch each other's backs, no matter what. Decision in the dark. Carl's eyes snapped open from the memory. Thunder rumbled overhead. The pact they had made echoed in his mind, no matter what. How could he break that promise now? He knew what he had to do. Quietly, Carl gathered his equipment. He slung extra ammo belts over his shoulders and checked his sidearm. His M60, the pig, as GIs called it, was caked with mud, but still operable. He was drenched, exhausted, and his hands were shaking, but a resolute fire burned in his chest. If no one else would go, he would go alone. Crawling away from the dim glow of his unit's shelter, Carl slipped off into the jungle, alone and against orders. Each step back toward the ambush site was a step deeper into enemy territory and into danger. The night enveloped him, with only intermittent flashes of lightning to light the way. Carl's senses strained for any sign of Franz or the enemy. Rain-soaked ferns brushed against his face as he crept forward. The world had narrowed to the cone of his flashlight, which he used sparingly, and the pounding of his heart. Every crack of a twig under his boot sounded like thunder to his ears. He was afraid, more afraid than he'd ever been. But his determination to save his friend was greater than his fear. Through the jungle. Alone. Back at the ambush site, the scene was haunting. Spent shell casings glinted in the mud, and scorched patches marked where grenades had detonated. In a flicker of lightning, Carl spotted a trail, footprints and a smear of blood leading away into the thick undergrowth. His pulse quickened. It had to be Franz's trail, dragged or carried away. The Viet Cong must have taken him alive. Carl followed the trail deeper into the jungle. He moved cautiously, mindful that enemy fighters could still be lurking. After about 20 minutes of careful tracking, Carl nearly stumbled upon a pair of enemy scouts moving through the brush. Heart pounding, he dropped low. With no choice but to engage, he crept close and took them by surprise. In a swift, silent rush, Carl neutralized the two Viet Cong soldiers before either could cry out. His hands shook in the aftermath. It was a grim task, but necessary to reach Franz. The enemy camp. From behind thick foliage, Carl finally spotted a small enemy camp dimly lit by lanterns. Amid a cluster of bamboo huts, he saw Franz tied to a post, bruised but alive, guarded by several armed guerrillas. Carl's stomach clenched. Franz was there, but the camp bristled with at least half a dozen enemy soldiers. Out of options and running on courage alone, Carl devised a desperate plan. Creeping around the perimeter, he slipped one of his grenades into an ammunition crate on the far side of the camp and pulled the pin. Boom! The sudden explosion shattered the silence and sent the camp into chaos. Flames and smoke billowed as Viet Cong fighters shouted in panic, thinking they were under heavy attack. In the confusion, Carl sprinted to his friend. Franz was dazed from a beating and the blast, but alive. With a few swift slashes of his knife, Franz sagged into Carl's arms, too weak to run on his own. Franz's eyes widened in disbelief as he realized who was holding him. "Carl, you came," he whispered. "I promised I'd never leave you," Carl replied fiercely, throwing Franz's arm over his shoulder. A yell went up. The enemy had spotted them. Bullets tore through the night as a few Viet Cong opened fire. Carl grit his teeth and fired back with his rifle, taking down one pursuer as he dragged Franz toward the tree line. They plunged back into the jungle, vanishing from the camp's flickering firelight. but a handful of enemy soldiers quickly gave chase, determined not to let their captive escape. Final stand and rescue. Karl pushed onward through the tangled jungle, practically carrying Franz now. Each step was agony, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to stop. Dawn was just breaking as the two stumbled into a small, rocky clearing, the extraction point from the day before. With the enemy close behind, Karl knew they could run no further. Gently, he laid the barely conscious Franz behind a boulder for cover. Summoning the last of his strength, Karl raised the flare gun he had taken from Franz's gear and fired it into the sky. The red signal flare arced up and burst above the treetops. Moments later, angry shouts and muzzle flashes erupted at the jungle's edge. The pursuers had caught up. Karl stood his ground, firing his remaining bullets toward the enemy to keep them back. A bullet grazed his side, burning pain across his ribs, but he didn't budge. He roared in defiance, determined to shield his friend to the end. Just when it looked like Karl would be overrun, the pounding whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades cut through the air. A U.S. Army Huey appeared over the clearing in answer to the flare. The cavalry had arrived. The Huey's door gunner opened up, spraying the tree line with machine gun fire. The Viet Cong dove for cover as the helicopter's guns rained down, forcing them to scatter. The Huey touched down, and 2 American soldiers leapt out to cover Karl. Finally spent, Karl used his last ounce of will to drag Franz and himself toward the chopper. Strong arms pulled them both aboard. As the Huey lifted off, leaving the enemy behind, Karl slumped next to Franz. It was over. They had made it out alive. Brotherhood and sacrifice. Aboard the helicopter, Karl finally allowed himself to breathe. A medic tended to Franz's wounds as Karl gripped his friend's hand, tears of relief mingling with the rain on his face. They had survived the impossible, together. Later that day at the field hospital, Karl sat beside Franz's cot. The 2 friends, bandaged but alive, shared a weary smile. In a hoarse voice, Franz whispered, "You kept our promise." Karl nodded and replied softly, "Always, brother." In the end, Karl and Franz's journey through hell taught a powerful lesson. True friendship, loyalty, and sacrifice can overcome even the darkest times. Their unbreakable bond showed that risking everything for a friend, fighting through hell to